for coming to this program. Really excited about this one tonight and looking forward to this. I just have to get the credit language out of the way and then I'll turn it over to the much more interesting part. This program was developed in connection with the exhibition Rural to Rockets, Box Elder County Takes Off. I know some of you have seen it. If you have not, please stop by after the event tonight. It's now on display downstairs, and it's our companion to the Smithsonian's traveling exhibition, Crossroads Change in Rural America, which was made possible at the Brigham City Museum by Utah Humanities. Crossroads Change in Rural America is part of Museum on Main Street, a collaboration between the Smithsonian Institution and State Humanities Councils nationwide. Support for Museum on Main Street has been provided by the United States Congress. Brigham City Museum of Art and History is a department of the Brigham City Corporation. Our work is made possible thanks in part to the support of the Box Elder Museum Foundation, the Utah Division of Arts and Museums, and our community members. And an extra thanks tonight, after the event, downstairs, if you come see the exhibit, we have been donated some pies from Maddox for you to enjoy. So I hope you'll have a chance to do that. We just don't want to do it, be distracted eating. Their pies are kind of messy if most of you have been to Maddox. It is my honor to introduce our speaker. Gregory Smoak is the consulting state scholar for the Utah tour of the Smithsonian exhibition, Crossroads Change in Rural America, and lead author of the Rural Utah at a Crossroads companion essay, which if you haven't read it yet, please take one or two, they're free on your way out. As Associate Professor of History at the University of Utah, he specializes in American Indian, American Western, environmental, and public history. With that.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon, evening. It's my pleasure to be here. As Alana said, I serve as a state consulting scholar for this exhibit. What that means is I essentially have worked to shape statewide content that accompanies this nationally touring exhibit. And I worked with Nate Housey, another one of the authors of the essays, right there, just so it's his day in the sun. Because Nate is very, he craves the spotlight. He's that kind of guy. Anyway, I encourage you to pick up a copy of the essay. It's the most visible product of the work that we do, but you know, it goes to a lot of other things as well, including these talks. And in the talks that I've done, I try to focus on issues of particular relevance to the host communities for the exhibit. And in doing so, I hope to provide context for the companion exhibit. And in this case, Rural to Rockets, Box Elder County Takes Off. I hear it's a blast. You should go see it. Couldn't help myself. Anyway, this time, I was telling a lot of this before, this exhibit gives me an opportunity to do something very different with a talk than I've done so far in this tour. So I've done talks in Colville, in Heber City, in Price, and in St. George. And I'll do talks after this in Green River, Blanding, and Ephraim. But this one in particular allowed me to approach one topic, and that is the military in the American West. And I was pretty excited to do that. This is an important topic and one that has a long-term history in the West that explains a lot about what we see around us. Now, rockets, of course, are not military necessarily in purpose, but that's certainly the way it starts out, right? That they are an extension of military and security concerns, and they're intertwined with the development of the aerospace industry in the American West. And so thinking about the long-term changing history of the military in Utah can hopefully enhance your tour of the exhibit, and when you're driving around looking at some of these landscapes, perhaps do that as well. Now, one of the things that I want to emphasize is change. The military has always seemingly played an important role in the history of the American West and of Utah. It's been a major agent in the creation and the transformation of rural places. But while its importance has been great, the role it has played, its impact it's had, have not remained static. They've changed over time. And as historians, that's what we look at. We look at change over time. The subtitle of the major exhibit, right, is Change in Rural America. It's not stays same in rural America. So while we say it'd be too simplistic to say the military was important, the importance has changed over time. So what I want to do is talk this evening, talk about those changes. And now the actions of the military had an important impact here even before the establishment of the Mormon colony in 1847. In the 19th century, perhaps the most important tool at the government's disposal to promote national expansion was the military. And on one level, this immediately brings to mind the Indian Wars, and I will talk about that in a little while. But the promotion of expansion also meant gathering knowledge of the region's peoples and its landscapes. And in this sense, making these unknown lands legible to Americans. That's a fancy way that scholars might put it. Now these efforts began with the Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark, whose mission was to find a pathway to the Pacific, open trade with indigenous peoples along the route, and bring back knowledge of the region's flora and fauna and landforms. The Lewis and Clark expedition was an unusual endeavor, and far from what we might think of as typically military, if you've ever read their journals. I mean, you got two guys who are co-commanders. That doesn't really go over in the military, right? It's a little bit loosey-goosey in that sense, right? Who ever heard of equal co-commanders? Still, the expedition set a pattern for future explorations of the West. Contemporary with Lewis and Clark were well-known expeditions led by Lieutenant Zebulon Pike. Most of you probably heard of Pike's Peak in Colorado, named for him. And the nearly forgotten Red River expedition led by surveyor Thomas Freeman and naturalist Peter Custis that went up the Red River, the border of Texas and Oklahoma. A lot of you have never heard of that expedition. Now, in subsequent years, exploration became more formalized, and it would be the officers of the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, the forerunner of today's Army Corps of Engineers, that would take a leading role in exploring, documenting, and mapping the American West. The Corps was founded by, let's see if anybody know, Thomas Jefferson. 1802, also the foundation of West Point. This is a painting of West Point in 1820. What Jefferson envisioned was his corps of topographical engineers, the intellectual elite. They didn't have to be wealthy, but people who would be trained engineers who would support the expansion of the nation, right? And so at the same time, you get the military academy at West Point. This is meant to train the engineers, and they would serve in traditional military capacities, like building fortifications and finding routes through terrain for attacks and so on like that. But it also meant, by the 1820s, surveying the routes of roads, canals, and railroads, right? We're literally discovering these lands for white Americans. Native people already knew it was there because they lived there. This meant expanding knowledge of the West. In 1820, Major Stephen Long led an exploring expedition staffed by Army officers and civilian scientists across the plains to the Rocky Mountains. Aside from having his name affixed to a mountain, which is called?
Long's Peak.
Yes, it was a trick question, right? It's the tallest peak in Rocky Mountain National Park. It's very visible from the Front Range, from the area around Denver and Longmont and Boulder, right? So he has his name attached to that. But what else he did was he deemed the Great Plains the Great American Desert. He wrote that on a map. And needless to say, he did not see the country going that way from here, right? He did not see the Great Basin. However, that name stuck, and for decades it caused great trepidation for those who were contemplating a trek to the west. Right? Now, undoubtedly, the most famous and influential of topographical engineers, and if he were here tonight, he would tell you that, was the Pathfinder, John C. Fremont. Between 1842 and 1846, accompanied by his trusty and soon-to-be famous guide, Kit Carson. And he really made Carson a household name with his report, and then Carson becomes, in a sense, serialized in all of these dime novels in the 19th century, becomes a household name. Fremont led 3 expeditions that ranged from the Wind River Range in Wyoming to the Pacific coast. And arguably, it was his second expedition that was the most important and consequential. He set out with the goal of mapping the Oregon Trail from South Pass at the south end of the Wind River Range in Wyoming to the Pacific coast. And in this survey, it was Fremont who confirmed that the lands between the Wasatch Range and the Sierra Nevada constituted a Great Basin. And it's written on the map right there, Great Basin. This is from his, that's a map from his compilation of his reports. Unlike the Great American Desert, this was accurate, right? It was something that, it dispelled the great myth of the river, of the Rio Buenaventura. Many of you might have heard of that, this idea that there was a river, a water passage that would lead you from the Great Salt Lake, or this area all the way to the Pacific coast. People had a pipe dream that they would get there easily. That was not the case. None of the waters that flow into the basin reached the sea. And so this was a critical addition to geographic knowledge, and it forever dispelled that myth. Along the way, Fremont and Company took a detour to explore Great Salt Lake. I bring that up because if that wall wasn't there, we could probably see Fremont Island, right? Passing just a short distance from where we are sitting this evening, the expedition brought with it an India rubber raft, and Fremont, Carson, and several others made a harrowing paddle out to an island in the lake. They found no fresh water, and the dark shadows they saw from the distance, which they assumed were trees, were just shadows. There are no trees, right? And so Fremont named it what?
Disappointment.
Yes, Disappointment Island. It would be Stansbury a few years later that named it after Fremont. I'm not sure how Fremont felt about that, because obviously he didn't think much of the island. I don't know if you saw this in the news, but Kit Carson's cross out there was just added to the National Register of Historic Places. During that expedition, Kit Carson, who had married a woman in New Mexico and converted to Catholicism, scratched a cross in a rock that's up at the summit of the island out there. And that has just been added to the National Register of Historic Places. Now, misadventures on Great Salt Lake notwithstanding, it is hard to express how influential Fremont's expeditions were at the time. His official reports of the first 2 expeditions quickly became popular reading. I don't think we can imagine that today. Like, we go down, let's get just some evening reading, and we're going to buy a publication that is a report of a topographical engineer. It's no exaggeration, though, to say that his report was a critical factor in shaping the Mormon migration to Utah. Among those who read Fremont's reports were Joseph Smith, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Brigham Young. Taylor and Woodruff excerpted portions of Fremont's reports in the Nauvoo Neighbor, the newspaper they published, and later Young and his advisors pored over the compiled volume of the expeditions that was published first in 1845 when planning their exodus from the United States. So that is where the idea is formulated that this is the place, is going to be that oasis zone along the foot of the Wasatch Range. So Fremont's knowledge was something that they took to heart. Now, only 2 years after the Mormon migration, it founded Great Salt Lake City. It was called Great Salt Lake City until 1871, and the Great got dropped. Major Howard Stansbury and his subordinate, Lieutenant John Gunnison of the Corps of Topographical Engineers, arrived to conduct a survey of Great Salt Lake. Now, in a time of growing animosity, Stansbury struck up a cordial relationship with Brigham Young and other church leaders. His survey was assisted by a number of Mormon men, including Albert Carrington, who also got He was Brigham Young's personal secretary, later editor of the Deseret News, and he got an island named for him as well. It was Carrington Island out there in the lake. Stansbury's massive final report, and I mean massive, you can still buy copies of it. The University of Utah Press did a reissue of it probably 30 years ago that I have a copy of. It's a big report. It may not have had the popular impact of Fremont's work, but it remains an essential source for Utah history and the history of exploration in the 19th century. Then between 1853 and 1855, Stansbury's survey, I might add, was 1849 to 51. From 53 to 55, there are 4 separate Pacific Railway surveys led by the topographical engineers. They are meant to map and describe potential routes for the first transcontinental railroad. Isaac I. Stevens, along with George B. McClellan, surveyed the northern Pacific route from Minnesota to Puget Sound. 2 southern Pacific surveys took place. Lieutenant Emil Weeks along the 35th parallel, and one farther south led by Lieutenants John Park and John Pope. You might recognize the names of some very unsuccessful Civil War generals here. McClellan, obviously, right? You might not have heard of Isaac Stevens, but he was the first territorial governor of Washington. He rushed back east to fight the Confederates and was immediately killed at the Battle of Chantilly, one of the first battles of the war. And John Pope, of course, was the disastrous commander of the Second Battle of Bull Run. So there's a lot of them there. It's not a surprise. A lot of the topographical engineers, remember, went on to major roles as commanding officers. Now, the 4th major survey made its way through the heart of Utah, between the 37th and 39 degrees, between 37 and 39 degrees north. And now, until he and 7 of his men were killed near Sevier Lake, the survey was led by Stansbury's old second-in-command, John Gunnison. So this is the famous Gunnison Massacre in 1853. Lieutenant Edward Beckwith assumed command after Gunnison's death and completed the survey to the Pacific coast, which included portions of what became the Central Pacific Railroad line. Now, despite the surveys and Stansbury's budding friendship with Brigham Young, the American military is first and foremost an extension of federal power. And that meant its relationship with the LDS Church in the mid-19th century was usually tense and often confrontational. And by 1857, of course, relations between the federal government and the church had seemingly reached a breaking point. Amid tensions over harassment of federal officials and Mormon moves to maintain their autonomy, the new president, James Buchanan, moved to replace Brigham Young as territorial governor. Believing that the Mormons would resist and wanting to appear strong to his Republican rivals, Buchanan sent a 2,500-man detachment to Utah led by Albert Sidney Johnson, who would be killed 5 years later fighting for the other side. He was the commander of the Confederate forces at Shiloh, where he was killed. The so-called Utah War was, in a sense, a fiasco that fizzled. Right? The Mormon Nauvoo Legion used scorched earth tactics to slow the army down. There were no pitched battles. By the time the army reached a temporarily deserted Salt Lake City, Brigham Young had struck a deal. In return for accepting the new governor and the army's presence in Utah, the troops would establish their camp far from the Mormon capital. And so they marched over 40 miles to the southwest. We were just talking about Eagle Mountain, out to Camp Floyd, which if you've ever been out there, well, now it's suburbia.
Yeah.
But up to a few years ago, it was in the middle of nowhere, right?
Way out there.
Yeah, way west northwest of Utah Lake, to establish Camp Floyd. Camp Floyd later was called Camp Crittenden when the Secretary of War Floyd resigned to join the Confederacy. But it was abandoned when the Army returned during the Civil War. When it was abandoned when the war broke out and the troops there were ordered back east. Now, when the Army returned during the war, the new commander would not be as conciliatory, to say the least. So this also brings us to the darker and more brutal side of the military's role in Western expansion, which was the subjugation, the removal, the dispossession of native peoples. And the decades after the Civil War saw the incorporation of the American West from the Great Plains to the Pacific Coast into the United States. And these were indigenous homelands. Now, a little over a year after Camp Floyd's abandonment, in October of 1862, Patrick Edward Connor arrived in Utah at the head of a column of California volunteer troops. Although he too would have preferred to be back east fighting the rebels, Connor's mission was twofold: to keep the overland trails open by suppressing native peoples, and to keep an eye on the Mormons, who were deemed untrustworthy and potentially disloyal. On a personal level, Connor detested the Mormons. He detested Brigham Young. And of course, there's that common story that when Connor arrived in Salt Lake City in October of '62, he marched right through the city and he established his new base, not 2.5 days right away, but right on the high ground looking down on the city, which the University of Utah sits now. My office at the American West Center is in a barracks that was built in 1873. Right, so one of the oldest buildings there. The original log buildings, none of those remain.
Well, they were used when I was in school. I worked in the annex.
Well, the annex is a different thing.
Across the street from the annex in one of the barracks.
Yeah. So these are what they do. I mean, the original barracks I'm talking about were log cabins.
Right.
The foundations were excavated a few years ago by the State Historic Preservation Officer. And so he marched right through the city. And of course, the story always is he kept a cannon trained on Brigham Young's house, and he kept another cannon trained on the temple, which was under construction downtown. It could easily have hit them from that distance. Now, while Connor never engaged in direct military action with the Mormons, he would try repeatedly to break the power of the church and the Mormon majority. And the main way he would try to do this eventually was by fostering the development of mining in Utah. It's a story we tell in the essay. He is also referred to as the father of Utah mining. And remember, he was an Irish immigrant who fought in the U.S. Army in the Mexican War, went to California during the gold rush, made money there in the town of Stockton, and witnessed the influx of tens and hundreds of thousands of outsiders that just engulfed the native people and the California, the Hispanic population of California, took over. And he figured that the easiest way to destroy Mormon power in Utah was to find gold and silver and have all of these people flock in and flood the territory. And so that's why he's considered or called the father of Utah mining. He's buried in the Fort Douglas Museum, and it says so right on his tombstone, father of Utah. Now, while he didn't fight he didn't take the Mormons on that way, his true fury became focused on the Shoshone people of northern Utah, specifically those in the Cache Valley. During his march across the Great Basin, though, he had already established a brutal pattern, which he defended, and others at the time would defend as the most humane course of action to prevent further violence. He ordered his subordinate officers to, quote-unquote, destroy every male Indian deemed to be hostile. Now, his hostility to the Mormons notwithstanding, his interests and those of the Mormon settlers came to intersect. Right? Now, after several miners traveling from Montana had been killed and tensions were rising between the settlers of the Shoshones and Mormon settlers in Cache Valley, Connor launched a surprise attack against the Shoshone village encamped for the winter along the Bear River. The attack killed the headman bear hunter and over 350 Shoshone children, women, and men. Now, while Mormon settlers did not participate in the carnage, their attitudes were actually ambivalent. At least one of them tried to warn the Shoshones. Right? Sagwitch later repeated a story of a local Mormon farmer who came to warn them that the army was approaching. But the Shoshones did not believe they would simply attack like they did. Right? That's not the way it had worked. There have been previous, I'm cutting a lot of the actual detailed history out here. They did not expect that would happen. On the other hand, it would be the Mormon settlers of Cache Valley who benefited from the massacre. whether they celebrated it or not. Connor's troops were led to the site by none other than, anybody know who that guy is? That's Orrin Porter Rockwell. Brigham Young's, the reputed leader of the Danites, Brigham Young's enforcer in the 19th century. He's buried just a short distance from my house in Salt Lake City, the Salt Lake City Cemetery. And people to this day, when they visit his grave, they leave empty shell casings lined up on it. A very infamous figure in Utah history. In any case, he guides the troops there. Local white leaders like Peter Mon, founder of Mon's Fort, which is today Wellsville, condemned the brutality and the violence, but they also understood that it secured their position in Cache Valley. And ultimately, Mon blamed the massacre on the Shoshones themselves. In a very famous letter to Brigham Young, he said that he, quote, felt his skirts clear of their blood, unquote, because they had ignored the path to righteousness and life that the Mormons had laid out for them and chose to follow their traditional ways. And so, again, very 19th century attitudes. And the same thing with Connor arguing that the most humane thing would be to kill all the men, right? Because then you would stop the violence. So this is, again, a very complicated picture of the 19th century here in northern Utah. Now, the Bear River Massacre was the greatest atrocity that took place during the subjugation of Utah's native peoples. Many other conflicts occurred, and most of these, both before and after Bear River, were carried out, though, by the Mormon militia, the Nauvoo Legion. And this was because Brigham Young sought to keep the army at arm's length throughout his lifetime. Remember what I said, that the army is mostly, there was tension or conflict? Brigham Young did not want large numbers of federal troops in Utah. That's the way it is. During the Black Hawk War, which stretched from 1865 and sort of fizzled out in 1872, it's not until the very end of that conflict that Brigham Young actually called for U.S. cavalry troops to become engaged in what had been basically a sporadic guerrilla warfare between Utes, Paiutes, and the Nauvoo Legion in central Utah. Right? Now, still though, through the remainder of the 19th century, the army remained at Fort Douglas and Fort Duchesne and other posts. As elsewhere in the West, the army was instrumental in dispossessing native peoples and opening the land to Euro-American settlement. So that's the other important way in the 19th century, finding out about the land, but then opening it by dispossessing native peoples. Now, by the time of Utah's statehood in 1896, tensions between the federal government and the church had subsided a great deal, and Utah's volunteered for service in both the Spanish-American War and World War I in great numbers. And what I want to do, it's important to note here that throughout this entire period, the United States relied upon a volunteer force in times of emergency. This was in line with the values of the Revolutionary War, that ideal of the citizen soldier, and it was rooted in the suspicion that a large standing army would be the tool for the government to oppress the people. This meant that after every major conflict, massive demobilization occurred. Within a couple of years in 1864, during the Civil War, there were 1 million soldiers in blue uniforms. 1 million. Within a few years, the United States Army totaled 25,000. They were scattered. All the artillery was along the coasts in case anyone tried to invade. And the infantry and the cavalry were scattered company by company in these tiny little posts all over the American West. Right? It was not what we think of today as the military-industrial complex or a large standing military. Up to World War II, the same would be true after each conflict. The army would shrink to a relatively tiny interwar force. And everything, though, is going to change with World War II and the Cold War. Now, unlike the 19th century when the American military facilitated the Euro-American colonization of the West, During and after World War II, the military and defense industries transformed vast areas of the West for their own purposes. The very conditions that made much of this region daunting for agrarian settlement, aridity and isolation, made it perfect for developing and testing aircraft and weapons systems, as well as training troops and managing logistics. Utah was far enough inland to make enemy attack improbable, if not impossible. And with a substantial population, Utah became central to the war effort of World War II. Historians Tom Alexander and Leonard Arrington likened the economic impact of World War II to that of a giant elevator that lifted Utah from the depths of the Great Depression. Utah suffered the Great Depression worse than most states, incredibly poor. Over the course of the war, the federal government spent some $650 million on military installations. I know today you're like, wait a second, isn't that a quarter of one V-2 bomber? Right, different money we're talking about today, but that was a lot of it. $650 million on military installations and equipment, another $240 million on contracts with privately owned defense businesses. Right, so we're pushing towards $1 billion during the 1940s. Right? Payrolls along the Wasatch Front increased 150%, from 100 million to 250 million, and the population increased by nearly 20%. Now, in some areas, particularly along the Wasatch Front, the character and use of rural land changed forever, and thousands of acres of prime farmland and orchards were transformed seemingly overnight into factories, military bases, and institutions. Now, today's younger, newer residents, and I know my students at the University of Utah that I'm going to be teaching in the fall, will find it difficult to imagine the Salt Lake Valley as a rural agrarian landscape. But before World War II, it was. In Salt Lake County, which it was, the Remington Small Arms Plant, which we don't have, I don't have a picture up here, but the Remington Small Arms Plant gobbled up 5,000 acres in Salt Lake County, which is today that vast industrial area west of Redwood Road within Salt Lake City. 5,000 acres. At its peak, the plant employed 10,000 in manufacturing 50 and 30 caliber ammunition. The plant accounted for most new jobs created in Utah between 1941 and 1942. That single plant. And it contributed to the expansion of other manufacturing. Between 1939 and 1935, Utah's manufacturing output increased by 200%. So much so that even when production at that arms plant wound down in 1944, Utah still faced a labor shortage. They're still looking for people to fill those jobs. Now, just to the south of the Remington Arms Plant, an equal-sized tract of farmland became the Kearns Army Air Base, and that's what you see pictures of here. Kearns served as a basic training facility for Air Corps personnel, and at its peak housed 40,000 troops and employed 1,000 civilians. The base became surplus after the war, but rather than returning the site to farmland, which the military had initially planned, influential Utahns, political leaders, lobbied for it to be sold for development. And why not? The infrastructure for a whole new city was already there. Streets, sewer systems, and so on. And so in 1948, 1,200 acres of the base were sold at auction, and a new city was born, which is called Kearns. It's another soccer question, yes. Kearns, where the Olympic ice skating oval is. One vestige of that air base is still there, Salt Lake County Airport number 2. There's an airport there where the Air National Guard's helicopter units are based, but it's mostly civilian aviation, right? People's private planes, but that's still there, Salt Lake City Airport number 2. All right. And there's Geneva for you, right? So these changes are not limited to Salt Lake Valley.
But it was originally Columbia Geneva Steel, owned by the government, and U.S. Steel contracted to run it.
Yeah.
Then it closed, and then it reopened.
Yeah,
Yep.
we'll just gonna, for ease of sake, we're gonna refer to it as Geneva. A lot of people say it's in Orem, but of course the Vineyard is now the little town.
Vineyard
It's
is right on top of those,
Yeah, they have a new town that was there.
yeah.
So Provo and Ogden were once surrounded by orchards and small family farms. But after the war, most who previously farmed worked in manufacturing, construction sectors. Most famously, right, the Geneva Works, 1,750 acres on the shore of Utah Lake. An inland site was chosen because of its security concerns, far enough inland that it would not be able to be attacked. By 1960, the plant alone employed 30% of the workers in Utah County. And majority of those were previously agricultural workers, right? So you're seeing this major shift. Go north, we get Hill. North of Salt Lake Valley, Hill Field opened in 1940, and I just drove by it now, and I can tell you it's still quite in operation. If you ever try to drive through there at rush hour, you know just how many people. For many years, Hill was the largest single employer in the state. It no longer is. I think it's surpassed by U of U Health and Intermountain Healthcare. Both employ more people than Hill Air Force Base does. But after it was important during the war as a maintenance facility, and you see two women here working on a bomber engine. So I mean, it's a good image. I'll talk a little bit about them, women entering the workforce as well. After the war, Hill continued to serve in those roles as for logistics and maintenance, but it also became an important base for missile command and for fighter aircraft. And today, of course, it is the home of the 388th and the 419th Fighter Wings. Not far from Hill, over 1,000 acres of farm fields and pastures, you're seeing a pattern here, right? Became Utah General Depot in 1941. At the time of its construction, it was the largest quartermaster depot in the United States. And today it's called Defense Depot Ogden, and it's under the jurisdiction of Hill Air Force Base. Now, for many rural Utahns, as well as rural Americans in general, this meant jobs and much needed income, an inflow of cash into small communities in the aftermath of the Great Depression. Again, Utah was hit terribly by the Great Depression. The new work was appealing, offered higher wages and steady work in agrarian areas that had suffered so much. And as more men volunteered or were drafted into the military, opportunities opened for women and immigrant workers. Many moved to the burgeoning Wasatch Front, as we've mentioned, but in other cases the work came to them. And here's a great example. I know many people know this story. The Standard Parachute Company of San Diego, California, again, looking for a workforce and a secure location, set up shop in Manti, in the Sanpete Valley, not too far from Ephraim, which will be another stop on the tour for this exhibit. Maybe I'll recycle this talk there just to talk about the parachute factory, right? It employed hundreds of Sanpete County women over the course of the war. And the war intensified other Utah's industries. The output of coal and copper mines doubled. Iron ore production increased by 625%. It wasn't huge to begin with. It's some of those numbers are always like 625%. Well, if you're starting out from a very small number,
Yeah.
not that hard to hit. Meanwhile, the U.S. Geological Survey searched for new mineral deposits across Utah, fueled by its desire to make the U.S. self-sufficient in metal production. And so new mines for tin, tungsten, copper, iron, lead, and zinc opened across Utah. And finally, the atomic era ushered in yet another new mining boom as the federal government enticed prospectors into scouring southeastern Utah for uranium, which led to post-war booms in towns like Moab and Blanding. And so what this illustrates, though, is that work in Utah was changing forever because of World War II. Rural Utah was changing forever.
Now, what about Bushnell Hospital?
Wait, I don't have time to talk about everything.
You're gonna talk about it? Okay.
I'm not.
You're not?
I don't have time to talk about
Oh.
everything.
But,
If I was talking about, I would, if I was gonna do that and talk about Indian schools too. I could mix those two together and talk about Intermountain. But yes, Bushnell was right over here at the mouth of Sardine Canyon. Most of you know that, right? And later became Intermountain Indian School. It was founded to really serve the families of the Intermountain West whose sons and husbands had been terribly injured during World War II, severe burn victims and so on, who needed long-term care. The reason it was here is so people from the Intermountain West End could visit in long-term. It wasn't having to go back to one of the other coasts. Now, in more remote and forbidding places, the military established some of its largest and most secretive facilities. Like other arid landscapes in the Great Basin in the Southwest, Utah's West Desert was envisioned as a wasteland, good for little else than a bombing range. Many wartime installations were established by executive order of the president as emergency measures. They withdrew large chunks of land from the public domain. Many were originally intended to be temporary, but some of those remained permanent fixtures in rural Utah. And some rural Utah communities have had to bear the long-term costs of chemical and contamination and radiation from weapons testing. But for others, the military was an economic lifeline. And in some places, both of these are equally true. And so here at the end of World War II marks an important break from the past. Remember, talking about demobilization after wars. After World War II, demobilization did not occur in the same way. It did start, right? Because remember that soldiers enlisted in World War II, enlisted for the duration plus 6 months. There's a lot of people who are leaving the military, but immediately the military starts to build up again, right? And that's because of the Cold War, right? Not only would the government pour billions of dollars into developing defense infrastructure in the West, the attitudes of many Americans changed as this perceived threat to liberty was transformed from, it was no longer internal, it was no longer the government, it was external, it was them. Right? It was the Russians, Soviets, it was communism. And people become more accepting of a large standing military. And this is great for the economy of places like Utah, right? But still, health costs, risks were not shared by all. Right? Now, what are some of these secretive facilities? Well, Wendover Army Airfield. This was actually founded before the United States entered World War II. It was founded in 1940, but it took on importance during the war. The base survived, its most famously was a training ground for thousands of bomber crews, including the men of the 509th Composite Group, which carried the atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so have anybody ever been out to Wendover Air Base? The B-29s are everywhere, B-29s, B-29s, B-20. There were like 3 crews of B-29s trained out there. This is the nose of a B-17. Thousands of B-17 crews trained out there. That was mostly what they did out there. This is a mock-up of Little Boy, and up until a few years, now they've just reopened this gym out there. I've been out to see this, but that bomb, that mock-up of that bomb, used to sit in the airport manager's office. I walked in there to talk to him one day. I'm like, what the? I mean, it's a full-size mock-up of the first atomic bomb. It's like, you think that's appropriate to have that in your office? Oh, it's fine. It's really kind of weird. Wendover didn't close when the war ended, right? And you can see the original here. This is what is today West Wendover, Utah. Here's where all the casinos are. They're not there quite yet, right? But that's all the barracks are out. 20,000 men out there training bomb crews, right? But the base survived into the 60s, largely as an auxiliary for Hill Air Force Base, and portions of its massive bombing range later became the Utah Test and Training Range. The Utah Test and Training Range is the largest contiguous area of restricted supersonic airspace in the United States. So if you ever drive south there and all those F-35s just keep taking off and heading out across the lake and getting up higher and going faster, that's where they're going. They're going out there to train. And the continued viability or vitality of Hill Air Force Base, which has long been one of Utah's largest employers, is due in part to that vast area west and southwest of Great Salt Lake. used for supersonic training and testing. Now, to the south of the Utah Test and Training Range is the Dugway Proving Ground, which to me is the most ominous of facilities, military facilities in the American West. It covers over 1,200 square miles. The Army's Chemical Warfare Service founded it in 1942, precisely because of its location. For much of its long history, Dugway was the nation's principal open-air testing ground for chemical, biological, and radiological weapons. I got the chance to do it. It's still a closed facility. You have to go through channels to get a tour. They don't do regular tours. I was lucky enough to do a tour of it a couple of years ago and see some of these sites. This is a historic photo from space, and this is the same thing. I took this photo, and this is a way in which they measure how far anthrax or other pathogens might go in the wind. So that tower releases stuff, and then there's monitors in rings at 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters, 5,000, 10,000 meters to see how quickly something disperses. And so this went on for decades in Utah's West Desert. And again, one of the scarier places, really. And you do have to have an escort. You do have to check in with the command where you move from one sector to another out there. It still is the storage facility for some of the worst biological agents, including anthrax, are stored in secure facilities out there. There's these bunker-like facilities in the middle of a secure zone, which are pretty amazing. You go past them, there's a berm of earth, 2 barbed wire fences, and a bunker inside of them, which is in the middle already of a secure facility. Like, they don't want people in there. It's also going to be a location where if we get samples back from Mars, they're going to be quarantined until we find out there's no Andromeda strain or anything else in there. Anyway, it's today, and it's also then became the center of the U.S. Army's drone program. Not the Air Force, but the Army's drone program. So now the Cold War had other long-lasting legacies for rural Utah, some of them pretty horrible. The arms race kicked off a uranium mining boom in southeastern Utah. The mining and milling of uranium ore exposed workers to radioactive gas with little regulation. It disproportionately affected miners and families on the Navajo Nation. And these exposures to hazardous materials came as a result of these remote locations, but also because of their relative lack of political power. The same might be true for the small Mormon communities in southern Utah. Between 1951 and 1962, the Atomic Energy Commission conducted 100 atmospheric nuclear weapons tests in the Nevada desert. They conducted over 900 underground later. But the atmospheric ones last for 11 years. Prevailing winds carried the fallout from these explosions over the small rural communities of southwest Utah. And the downwinders began to suffer abnormally high cancer rates, and by the late 1970s, the problem was too great to ignore. In 1983, the U.S. District Court in Salt Lake City found the government liable for the suffering. The decision was overturned on appeal, and it was not until 1990 that Congress finally acknowledged the nation's responsibility to provide compensation to the survivors. And so the Cold War also, I know I'm running on very long, aren't I?
Fine.
I'll try to finish this up. And so the Cold War provides the immediate context for the emergence of the rocket and missile industry in Utah, which is the subject of the Brigham City Museum's exhibit. At the end of World War II, I already got that up there. At the end of World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union raced to develop rocket technology. There's an old joke that would go around is, which German scientist did each side grab to advance their rocket science faster than the others. The United States, of course, snagged Wernher von Braun. fairly problematic figure who remained very influential though in rocket and development and work for NASA even. In any case, the race became far more intense a couple of times. One in 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic weapon. Right? 1953, the Soviets conducted their first thermonuclear weapons test, just a year or two after the United States. A thermonuclear weapon, or a hydrogen bomb, is far more destructive. You wouldn't know the difference if one landed on you, one or the other, it wouldn't matter, right? But still, in terms of the destructive power of a thermonuclear weapon, and at the same time they moved towards developing true intercontinental ballistic missiles. You know, in the U.S. responded by rushing forward the development of its own ICBM, the Atlas. And the Atlas was a liquid-fueled rocket, like most of those at the time were. So you had to set the rocket up, you had to fuel it, and then you had to wait for that amount of time as you're fueling it, and then you could launch it. It was a fairly lengthy, expensive process. And so in 1956, when the missile industry came to Utah, the focus was largely not on liquid fuel, but on solid fuel propellants. That's the important part, technology, right? The expense and the time of the liquid fuel could be taken away by solid fuel rockets. They have a long shelf life, and they can be fired within minutes of an alert, right? And so the story of Thiokol's arrival, which is today Northrop Grumman in Box Elder County, and the development of technologies like the Minuteman missile and later applications for space exploration, and the economic impacts of the community are told in the museum's exhibit. So I'm not going to talk about those. You go down to eat pie and see those. And Thiokol, which is part of the missile development story in Utah. By the late 1950s, Sperry Rand had set up shop in Salt Lake City. Marquardt Corporation set up in Ogden, and Hercules Powder Company, an old gunpowder company from Pennsylvania, set up its works out in Magna and began the manufacture of solid fuel rockets in 1958. Now, not all, this is my next stop on this tour, so hopefully I'll reuse this slide there. But not all communities that once benefited from missile development have fared as well as Box Elder County or Brigham City. The Air Force came to Green River in 1964 when it opened the Utah Launch Complex, which was a remote installation in New Mexico's White Sands Missile Range. And for the next 11 years, Athena and Pershing missiles were fired from Green River, arced their way over Canyonlands. Yeah, right? Canyonlands, the newest national park, 1964. Right, so you're going to fire them over there into the mid-70s to hit White Sands Missile Range next to another national park in New Mexico. Eventually, though, the launch testing was moved to a base closer to White Sands, and the facility closed, taking the jobs and the income with it. You know, easy come, easy go in a small community like Green River. That's pretty devastating. And you can see here, this is what it looks like today. I don't know if it's the exact same building, but this building is this building here. You see the missile on that track, and they would load them, back them up, and fire them. The remains of it are still out there. If it's about 5 miles from Green River to southeast, you just drive right out and wander around if you want. Now, though, still today, though, Utah benefits greatly from the military. I'll try to wrap this up fairly quickly here. The state sits firmly in the middle of the pack when it comes to military spending. In 2021, federal defense spending in Utah totaled $6.3 billion, ranking it 26th among states. That included $4.3 billion in contracts, number 25, $2 billion in wages, number 23, and overall defense spending 26th place. So sort of right there in the middle. That works out to $1,877 per resident, and that's approximately 2.7% of Utah's GDP. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that puts Utah in 18th place, and agriculture, all of agriculture in Utah accounts for less than 2% of Utah's GDP. Anybody know what the most money comes from? Biggest sector in Utah economy?
Agriculture.
No, agriculture is less than 2%. Financial services, banking and so on, 20% of Utah's economy. You look to, every year the Kem Gardner Center at the University of Utah releases an economic report to the governor. I always kind of geek out and go through to see what's in here, you know, and that for the last, you know, a while here, that's the largest single sector in the Utah economy, financial services. Real estate, construction, those kind of things are just behind that, but still. Okay. All right. So in closing, I hope that I've provided you with some context for your tour of Crossroads and from rural to rockets. And the stories of change in rural Utah are many, and thinking about the importance of the military is just one possibility. And so I invite you to tour the exhibits and think about all of the other stories that make rural Utah unique. So thanks for listening tonight. And I kind of ran over, but I'm happy to answer a question if anybody has a question.